I am the proud young Irishman in Ulster's hill. My life began a happy boy. The green fields ran and I kept going on man's laws. But when my age was barely 10, my country's wrongs were told again by the tens of thousands marching then, and my heart stirred to their cause. So I'll wear no convict's uniform, nor meekly serve my time. A Britain might run Ireland's spite, its 100 years of crime. I learned that centuries of strife, of cruel laws, injustice rife, and I saw now in my own young life the fruits of foreign sway. Protesters threatened, tortured men, visions nurtured, passions flamed out, rage provoked, rights cause defend. This is the conqueror's way. So I wear no convict's uniform, nor meekly serve my time. A Britain mine from Ireland's spite, its 100 years of crime. Descendants of proud Connacht and Concannon serfs, cruel pretense and man's inhumanity to man has scorned a trusty slave. No strangers are these bolts and locks, no design these dark hitch blocks. Cruel Cromwell lives while Thatcher talks. Sure the bullies, they taunt our bridge. So I'll wear no convict's uniform, nor meekly serve my time. A Britain mine run Ireland's spite, its 100 years of crime. Does Britain need 1,000 years of protest, riots, death and tears? Or will the last decade of fears of any decade swell? An end to Ireland's agony,
They show Tucson tape. They will not criminalize us, rob us of our true identity, steal our individualism, depoliticize us, turn us out as systemized, institutionalized, decent, law-abiding robots. Never will they label our liberation struggle as criminal. On March 1st, 1981, in the H blocks of Long Kesh, Republican prisoners began a hunger strike, which was to last 214 days, and witness the deaths of 10 prisoners, 10 Republican volunteers.
May 5th, Bobby Sands, aged 27. May 12th, Francis Hughes, aged 25. May 21st, Raymond McCreish, aged 24. May 21st, Patsy O'Hara, aged 24. July 8th, Joe McDonald, aged 30. July 13th, Martin Herson, aged 26. August 1st, Kevin Lynch, aged 25. August 2nd, Kieran Dougherty, aged 25. August 8th, Paul McElwee, aged 23. August 20th, Mickey Devine, aged 27.
This tape is dedicated to their memory, to the memory of all those who died in the anti-H block Armagh Jail agitation campaign.
Hello, welcome to Scalta. My name is Joe Austin, and you're very welcome to this special edition of Scalta, which we have called 1981 in song and in story. The music that you just heard is taken from this cassette that was secretly recorded inside the high security prison called Long Kesh. 1981 was a horrendous year. In March of that year, Bobby Sands embarked on a hunger strike. He was joined by many prisoners, 10 of whom would die. Many died outside of the prison. We intend to take you through that period. Women in Armagh, who you'll hear later on, also were on protest. And during this programme, you will hear from our sponsors, and you will also hear from those who send solidarity to the prisoners on protest. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by two men who were key to that prison protest. I'm joined by Brendan McFarland, better known as Bick, who was the officer command Republican prisoners in the H block of Long Kesh. And I'm also joined by Lawrence McKeown, 70 days in hunger strike, close to death when the hunger strike ended. So Lawrence, if I can begin with you, it's virtually impossible for anyone to imagine what prevailed inside Long Kesh and Armagh that propelled prisoners to such a momentous decision. This year in October we will celebrate the 40th anniversary. We will commemorate the 40th anniversary of the hunger strike. But can you tell me what conditions were like inside the prison, and what was the mood inside the prison?
Well, to give a sort of a condensed history of it, Joe, I mean, 81 can only be seen in the context of the 5 years of protest that went on before it. People often ask, like, how could 10 people, one after the other, die on hunger strike? They must be so committed. I don't think it's something that could have happened just once people went into prison. It was, as I say, a result of 5 years of extreme conditions, brutality, starvation, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it all began with 1976, as I say, to give it a shortened history, was a very particular year, the year I went into prison in August, and it was the year that the criminalisation policy was brought in by the British government. We know now it was part of a much wider counterinsurgency project against the IRA. It which took an austerisation and normalisation, all of this. But basically it was to take away political status, which had been enjoyed at that time by both Republicans and Loyalists. There had been a recognition that people involved in the conflict were political.
Yeah.
And that was an image that I suppose the Brits didn't want around the world, that people were held in a Long Kesh, which was basically seen as a prisoner of war camp. So they built a new part of the jail, the H blocks, and they decided from the 1st of March 1976 that anyone sentenced for their part in the conflict would just be treated as common criminals, and you'd wear prison clothes and do prison work. I ended up in the Crumlin Road prison in August, and the first person to be sentenced under this new regime was Kieran Nugent. He was in the wing with me in C wing. Kieran was already, I think he was about 18 at the time, but he already had been interned, he already had been on remand, he had been shot by Loyalists. This guy along with him was shot dead. So it's an important thing at that time that people were so young. I was 19, almost 20, and that was probably the average age. And we were very, I suppose, naive at that time about this policy, sort of a vague knowledge about it. And I remember actually the Sunday before Kieran was due to be sentenced, Barney McReynolds from the Margate area of Belfast called us together as OC and said, look, Kieran's going to be sentenced next week. Our policy is we don't wear the prison uniform or do prison work, and that's it. And everybody went, yeah, no problem. Went back to playing football and walking around the yard. Kieran was sentenced, taken down to H blocks, refused to put on the gear. There's a famous statement about, he says, you'll have to nail it to my back. Was beaten up, thrown in a cell, was naked, and then was given blankets. And that began what became known as the blanket protest. It lasted 5 years. Kieran did his full time on it and then was released. And that was obviously something we didn't envisage.
Can I ask you, Lawrence has said there about the young age of many of those who were leading the protests and ultimately who would die and would be on hunger strike. You became the officer commanding the IRA prisoners in the blocks. What age were you?
I think when I came into jail in 75, I came into the cages in 76, I was 23, 24. So I would have been a lot older than most of the ones who were on the blanket protest. And, from 17 up to late teens was a considerable amount of young people on the protest, very determined. And forceful in their way in terms of they were not going to allow themselves to be broken, but there was a huge number of young people. The biggest bulk, in fact, practically everybody that was on that protest was in their late teens and early 20s. There were very few beyond that age. Joe McDonnell, who died on hunger strike, was up around 29 or 30 when he went on hunger strike. So he was one of the oldest prisoners, I suppose, in that sense there.
Initially our protest was fairly passive. It went on for that length of time up until March, but then it intensified into a no-wash protest, and that continued for the next 3 years. I didn't wash from March 1978 until the 2nd of March 1981, the day after Bobby Sands began his hunger strike. In some sense I was lucky because during that period of time there was forced washes, which were just another way of brutalising people. And Beck could talk about it because he was one of the ones that endured it, but people were just brutalised. And it's another important thing. There was an inquiry, independent tribunal done a couple of years ago, which interviewed a pile of ex-prisoners and former prison governors and doctors about the lack of medical treatment and how actually medical treatment was used actually to justify the beatings and the forced washes. And the forced washes was literally where people are dragged out, held down, shears used to cut off their beards and their hair. You're seeing people on visits with tufts of hair here, with black eyes, with cuts on them, thrown into baths of cold water or scalding hot water, scrubbed with Dax scrubbers and disinfectant, all on the basis that a doctor stood and said, yes, that person has head lice. Now he did it from a distance of about 15 foot. No one ever had head lice.
How would he know?
No, and it's interesting to see, and I have the document, it was a confidential document by the NIO, and it's, you see these in other wars of how the Northern Ireland office put the onus on the prison doctor and said, we have been informed by the chief medical officer that there's a danger to prisoners' health if they're not washed. There's no danger, we survived.
It seems to be, from an outside looking in, it seemed to be that many of these so-called doctors acquiesced and were fully cooperative with the prison administration. They either turned a blind eye or they justified what was happening. 80, there is a hunger strike. It ends with what many believe, including myself, believed was nearly a gentleman's agreement with the British government, that they would move on the issues that the men and the women in Armagh, who also had embarked on a hunger strike, that they would agree on and move on the issues they'd agreed on. They rescind that. They backtrack on their ideas. A second hunger strike is nearly inevitable, which of course is led by Bobby. Bobby helped until that point. Brenton had been the OC in the prison. You become the OC.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you can recall how you felt that immense responsibility, and I'm sure you didn't volunteer for it.
No.
But a young man, you're in the middle of all of this, you know a second hunger strike is about to be commenced. We all know, and you, I suppose, that it was a real possibility that prisoners would die. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's not a position that anybody relished, and I certainly didn't want it. And I vehemently argued with Bobby Sands that I wasn't going to do it. I'm not sure if it was Danny or yourself was up. I think it might have been Danny on a visit. He says, I've sent word to lads outside that you'd be taking over. And he hadn't discussed it with me. He hadn't asked me. And I said to him, what do you mean I'm taking over? And he says, well, you're going to be, when I go on this hunger strike, he says, it'll be staggered. I'll go on first, and then the lads will follow 2 weeks or a week at a time or whatever, and you'll be taking over. And I says, wait a minute, hold on a wee second. I'm further down the line. There's a vice OC, there's an adjutant, and all the rest of it. And I says, for example, Shanna Walsh is the vice OC.
Another prisoner, yeah.
Yeah, Shanna Walsh, yeah. He's the vice OC. I says, not only that, I says, he's been in the cages through political status, has been out, is back in, and understands the politics of this criminalisation process from top to bottom. I says, well versed, well able. And Bobby said to me, yeah, but you're making one mistake. I says, in terms of you're leaving something out. I says, what? He says, that's my best mate. And I says, and what has that got to do with this situation? He says, well, let's just suppose that we reach a crisis point during the hunger strike, and the Brits decide to engage in some form of negotiations. I says, yeah, and what? Oh, he says, he'll not let me die. And I said, there was a bit of a pause then, and I says, what do you mean? He says, well, he'll not let me die. And I says, well, what you're saying is that I would. Oh yeah, he says, that's it, and that's the way it has to be.
What a responsibility.
Yeah.
What a responsibility.
And I, in a sense that at the time I've thought on it a number of occasions, and I was sort of dumbfounded by the fact that, is that the hard-nosed person that you think I am? He says, no, that's what you have to do, because if I am not capable or in a position to articulate our argument for our demands, you have to be starting there saying, no, that's not what he wanted, or that's not what they've asked, and that's not what we want, so I'm sorry, we can't take that.
Were there a group of men who had volunteered to go on hunger strike? Was this from a pool of people who put their names forward? How was the selection done?
Well, this goes back to the first hunger strike as well, that when hunger strike action was decided as the last option, we had sent word throughout all the blocks to everybody, explaining to the volunteers that we were going to be having a hunger strike, and if anyone felt that they could take that course of action, if they felt they were up for it, would they consider it, pointed out all the difficulties and the severity of the decision in terms of not only the physical severity to themselves, but the impact, the emotional impact of their families, and all the heartache that would bring along. And we had somewhere in the region of over 80 people who'd put their names down.
Amazing.
Yeah, put their names down. And then just out of the blue, Bobby Sands said to me, that replacement strategy, have you got everything sorted out? I said, yeah. But we had a list of names, and I had gone through it with the camp staff, and we'd gone through it, and we had selected 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of who would be replacing who in the event of a death, while people were still hoping and praying that we wouldn't have to reach that stage. And in the next breath he says, right, that's fine, all sorted. Here's me, yeah, it's all sorted. And he says, well, who did you pick to replace me? And I was sort of taken aback. It just sort of caught me. And my initial answer was, well, you shouldn't really be concerning yourself about that. You have a visit tomorrow with your family, and you should be getting prepared for that. And you know, you're going on hunger strike in the morning, or this morning, whatever it was, you have a visit with your family. And he stopped me in full swing, and he says, listen, he says, I'm going to tell you something. He says, you need to have your head around all this here, he says, because see, in 2 months' time, I'm not going to be here. And you're going to be making difficult decisions. He says, so who did you pick to replace me? And I sort of took a breath for a minute, and I just says, well, if you must know it, it's actually Joe McDonnell. And he just thought for a second, and he says, that's a great choice. That man will never let you down. And in the next breath,
It's amazing.
and in the next breath, he says to me, who did you say had the tobacco? And I says, Philip Rooney has it. He said, right, he's away for tobacco. And I just turned to Jake and I said, I don't believe that. But that was a measure, Joe. That was a measure of the commitment, determination, dedication, and the foresight of the individual. That was total focus that I had never witnessed anything like that before.
I want to just direct this to Lawrence, and I've read lots of the writings, and I've interviewed you quite recently in another programme where you talk about slipping into death, that journey, that there's an inevitability, that you feel you're getting weak and all of that. If there was any doubt when Bobby began the hunger strike, if there was any doubt whatever that prisoners would die, by the stage that you had joined the hunger strike, it was a certainty. It was, this is what is going to happen. How do you prepare yourself, and what sustained you to embark on such a course of action?
Well, as I said, Joe, by the time I joined it, which was the 29th of June, 4 prisoners already died, and I think we all knew by then we're in for the long haul here. I think once Bobby died, he was elected a member of Parliament during his hunger strike, so the fact that they let an elected member of Parliament die, they were going to let others die, which they did. The 80 hunger strike and then the 81 were meant to end the protest, the 5 years of what we talked about there. It was meant to bring us our demands. So it was really a mindset of this is the final battle, and it is a battle. And BCN is very much part of it. We're in the front line, rightly or wrongly, as active service units or whatever you want to call it, active volunteers. Criminalise us, criminalise the struggle. So there's that mindset. Plus, there's been that 5 years of just intense protest. Extreme conditions. So in that context, hunger strike doesn't sort of be as bleak as maybe as somebody sitting today thinking, oh, put something in hunger strike. Like, if you're in that, another thing of being like, there was no other option of, well, you could do hunger strike, or you could do this, you could do that. It was either hunger strike or just total surrender, capitulation, which wasn't what happened. We're just that mindset is not. So that I suppose in a sense stills you in it. I was 24 at the time. I was single. I believe totally in the struggle. Believe we were right doing it. So all of that I think contributes to giving you a strength. And then also the other thing, the main thing I think, was that amazing bond of friendship that grew during that time. I mean, it was like people try to describe it as brothers or family or whatever. It's maybe even something beyond that.
Deeper than that.
Deeper in that, which is hard to articulate, which means that someone on the hunger strike, and it comes that, as Beck says, that point where well, I'm way out here. But the hope is that your other comrades will benefit from what's happening. So it's not something specifically for you, it's for the group, and I think that's what everybody's seeing themselves is very much part of, and which right up until the end gives you strength. And I know being there, and 5 other hunger strikers died while I was in the prison hospital, and right up until the end, and everybody wanted to live, but then try to live as long as possible. But then it comes to a point, and you can actually see it in someone when you know that they realise now it's
death.
It's death.
Bobby Sands' death and that of the other hunger strikers spread the plight of Irish nationalists throughout the world and ignited a new generation of Irish Republican activists. The Brehon Law Society and its members are part of their legacy.
My name is Kathy Stanton, and I'm the current president of the Brehon Law Society of Nassau County. The human rights violations that took place, the abolishment of the special category status that IRA prisoners had previously been granted as political prisoners, were a line that was drawn in the sand. The brave actions of these young martyrs was compelling, just as the actions of the British government was infuriating. I remember thinking that there was no way the government would allow these young men to die, but we all know how it ended. Now, as the mother of two young men, 18 and 21 years old, I have a different perspective. One as a mother who cannot fathom what these mothers had to endure as they watched their future slowly die. This commemoration is a reminder that while much has been accomplished, there is still much more to be done.
When Bobby Sands went on hunger strike in March of 1981, boy, did it wake me up, and it caught my attention. I got very much involved, only because of him and the other 9 brave, courageous hunger strikers. But for them, I probably wouldn't have gotten so interested in my culture and the injustices of the North. We're still in search of a united Ireland, although it seems closer than ever.
On March 1st, 1981, Bobby Sands began the second hunger strike. The hunger strikes, because of the huge daily protests, were now a major American story that would be covered on national and local TV news. On the day that Bobby Sands would die, more than 10,000 people in New York alone would close down the streets between the British consulate and Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, and other protests would be held across the country. More than 20,000 would stand with the brothers of Bobby Sands and Marie McCreesh, and with the sisters of Patsy O'Hara and Joe McDonnell, to humiliate England's Prince Charles when he came to Lincoln Center in June. The hunger strike has triumphed over criminalization and Margaret Thatcher, because America and the world now recognize that criminals do not die such deaths for the freedom of their country. Only patriots do. Hibernians and Irish Americans can be proud of the part we played in the victory of the hunger strikers, but we will be prouder still when we help to achieve the ultimate victory that the hunger strikers really died for: freedom for all Ireland.
Fáilte roimh chuig an cumara seo tá ma iontasásta a bheith ag cainte semrá seo inneo agus iad ag inseint a chud scéalta ó Ardwacha. So I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Mairead Farrell. I'm a Sinn Féin TD for the Galway area, and I'm delighted to be here as part of the 40th anniversary commemorations of the hunger strikes. I'm delighted to be here with 4 strong, proud women from Armagh Jail. I'm looking forward, and interesting stories will be told, I'm sure. No pressure on anyone. But first of all, I'd like if the 4 of you could maybe introduce yourselves. So Sheila, maybe start with yourself.
My name's Sheila Dara. I'm from a small nationalist area in East Belfast known as the Short Strand. I was in Armagh Jail from August 1976 until August 1981.
Okay, Anne-Marie?
I'm Anne-Marie Quinn, from the Greater Ballymurphy area of Belfast. Ballymurphy better known for the Ballymurphy Massacre, the Spring Hill Massacre, and for the Kelly Spar bombing, and very, very involved during the Troubles, and Ballymurphy was very much on the map during the prisoners' time, during the H-Block struck.
Sinead?
I'm Sinead Moore, stroke Walsh, from the Landune area of Belfast. I went to Armagh Jail in February 77 and was there to August 84.
Okay, Mary?
Mary Doyle from Greencastle, just outside North Belfast. I first went into Armagh Jail when I was 18, which was 1974. I had political status then, was recognised for what I was, and I got 5 years, done 2.5. Was back in again just under a year later in September 77, and didn't get out to 83.
So you went in 1976. What was that like? How long did you get at the point when you were going in?
Well, I had been an active Republican from I was 16 years old, which is probably the case with a lot of those who were part of the Republican movement at that time. You know, you became involved at a very young age. And it's, you know, you try to explain to people don't wake up one morning and decide to become involved in a struggle. Circumstances created every single one of us. Every one of us. We didn't ask for a war. It came to us. It came to our doorsteps. In a lot of cases, it was, like in areas like mine, there was a lot of sectarianism in towards my small nationalist community. And the IRA grew out of a defence organisation that protected wee communities like that. It's hard to explain to somebody who's never been in a prison before, because you walk into this atmosphere and there are these female prison warders, and you have to take a bath. It's like something you see on TV. You have to take a bath as if you're lousy or something, and they're watching you while you're doing it. And for a young woman of 18 who's never been put into that kind of position, coming from the background that we would come from, you wouldn't even undress in front of your sisters in the bedroom and stuff like that. So it was very disconcerting.
Well, as Sheila earlier said, when you went in the Armagh jail, we really, well, I hadn't either, hadn't no clue basically what I was facing, and it's a very old prison, Armagh, and it's very archaic, dull. I don't know what way it happened. I just ended up with the girl from the Strand, Anne McVeigh. She just happened to be on her own, and was one of the, I think it was actually Sheila said to me about going in with Anne McVeigh, and you just went in there and you were like, yeah, I'll go with her wherever you...
Whoever will take me.
Yeah, wherever you take me, because it's all new and everything was coming at you.
Yeah.
So to be honest, you couldn't wait, I think. Well, I know that first night I couldn't wait to get in, get the door closed.
Yeah, and be able to process the whole thing.
And just to get settled down and process it. And then Anne was later released. Anne McVeigh was innocent. Another one at that time. There were loads of innocent people being arrested, and she was one of the lucky ones that got off at her trial.
I was 17 and had been brought up fairly comfortably, and had 4 sisters, 5 brothers, and the family sort of concentrated an awful lot on education and the boys' sports, the girls' Irish dancing and swimming, and they were very into active things. And then when the British Army came on the streets, it was years of things happening and shootings and hearing people getting beat up and brothers being arrested and house being raided all the time. The house was shot through, the paratroopers shot through the house, and an awful lot of things happening. So it was a normal process of being reared in a Republican home, where you always told about the martyrs of Kevin Barry and Tom Williams, and back as far as 1798 you were told about Robert Emmet, and so with the Republican background, which we were very proud of. But when the trouble started, then the automatic thing was, my father had died in 1970, leaving my mother to our 10 children. So the automatic thing for her was to try and protect us. So while she was trying to protect us, you couldn't protect anybody from the British Army, because they beat up whoever they wanted and wrecked houses whenever they wanted. So it was a natural thing to go into the Republican movement.
It was a dire, horrible, hateful situation. And the only option was you remain there and keep your dignity, or you go on to the working wings and let, it's like as Bobby Sands says, I am Sir, you are 1066, and we were not a number. There's no way we were going to be just numbers. We were Republicans. If it wasn't for the political situation in these 6 counties, not one of us would ever have seen the inside of a prison.
So I think that gives a good kind of background and context to the summer of 1980, say, where I assume there was greater conversations in that about the start of the hunger strike. So Sheila, can you kind of give us a bit of a summary of how that was for yourself, I suppose?
It was a process that had been going on. It was a discussion that had been going on for quite a while. It didn't just materialise out of nowhere, because as I said at the start, there were people who had served their full sentence on the protest without any remission in horrific conditions in the H blocks and then in Armagh. Like for instance, a friend of ours who died just there about 2 months ago, Shirley Devlin, was only 17 years old when she came into Armagh. She was released, the first woman released on the No Wash protest. They told her to take a bath on her way out, and she refused. She wouldn't do it because she wanted people to see what we were living with. She went out in her wee duffel coat that she'd been wearing and to keep her, because it was very cold, to keep her warm, and you know, she wanted people to see the horror of it, and she was still very young because she did 3 years. She was just over 20 years old when she went out, you know. So that's an example of what was even coming out of the jails after having served their sentence in such horrific conditions. You see photographs of the blanket men like Fran McCann and Kieran Nugent still with the beards and the long hair because they wouldn't shave on the way out. They wanted people to see.
Maureen Gibson and Eileen McCampbell all come out.
We needed people to see the situation that we were in. Another woman, for example, Rose McAllister, was 40 years old when she was sentenced to 2 years. She had a 19-year-old, 15-year-old, 12-year-old and 2-month-old child when she was sentenced to 2 years, and Rose came straight in onto the protest. She was released again from the wash. Her youngest son was only 2.5 when she got out. So there were situations like that. And then there were people who, they were feeling it like mentally, because after a while it does start to get you. There's no denying it. It does start to get to people. It was decided then that the women would join the hunger strike on the 1st of December 1980 and began with 3 women, which was your Aunt Mairead, Mary and Margaret Nugent.
And how was that for you, that whole process? Like, I mean, that's a massive, obviously, decision to take.
Obviously, it was something I didn't take lightly, and I just couldn't think of myself. I mean, I had to think of my family. I mean, to be very brief, I had to think of my daddy, who wasn't in great health. My mummy had been murdered while I was in jail the first time in 1975 by the UVF. So my daddy was on his own, and I had 2 younger brothers, so I obviously had to take everything into consideration. The first day that was announced on the 1st of December, we obviously refused our breakfast that morning, and there had been a statement released to the press. But what I need to say is too that the Republican movement didn't want a hunger strike.
Yeah.
So the men had to fight. The men in the blocks didn't want the women on it, and it wasn't that they thought they were being macho or anything like that. So we had to fight to get on it too. So the men had started, the 7 men, it went on 27th of October, and Mairead, Margaret and myself the 1st of December. And lucky enough, the 3 of us were put into a double cell together on that first day. Jail food is notoriously known as being it used to be fat with a bit of meat through it. It used to be very small portions. 9 times out of 10 it was cold. All of a sudden there was these plates of overflowing food, piping hot, that was left in our cells. And our cells wasn't without food the whole day. You know, once they took your breakfast out, then lunch, they kept the breakfast there until lunch, and then lunch until your dinner, and you know, so there was food in it 24 hours a day. We laughed at this. We just thought it was just them being petty. Our comrades were telling us, visitors had told them that all sorts of thank you cards and, you know, just support letters and everything else. We didn't get half them, but we did get hate mail, English, postage, postmarks, calling us for all the murdering bastards and I hope you die a very slow death, and you know, we got all that mail. That wasn't a bother. So anyway, this continued in the so-called prison hospital, and we had a wee smuggled radio that we only, because we were away from the women then, so we couldn't hear anything from them, but we used to listen to it at night when the screws went off on the wing, and we knew, because there was always great communication between the blocks in Armagh and the movement outside, that we knew Sean McKenna was in a very bad state, so we were really, really concerned about him. So on the 18th of December, and that night, we were listening to the radio and the news come on, and the top story was the hunger strike's over. And the 3 of us looked at one another and said, did I hear that right? So we obviously had to wait another hour for the news to come on, and it was the same thing. But unknowns to us, Danny Morrison had tried to get into the jail, and the NIO refused him to let us know what was happening. So it was the next morning, and the governor came in when they were bringing in the breakfast and says, oh, you're off the hunger strike then? and Mairead looked at him, and she could give some looks, and took him from the feet right up and says, no, we're not. And we still weren't aware of what was going on. So we then, as I say, we were still entitled to our hours exercise, so which we had to go through where the other women's were, their wing. So Mairead went in and had a meeting with Sheila, and was it yourself, Sheila, then was called for a visit?
It was after that meeting with Mairead that I got the visit with a priest who had been a go-between between the Brits and the organisation. And
so that's when then we decided, when Sheila was told officially sort of thing, we decided then to end the hunger strike. We were elated because, number one, we knew Sean McKenna would get treatment that he needed. We obviously thought that we had got our 5 demands, you know, because it wouldn't have ended if we hadn't have.
Was it, what did you notice first? Was it that you noticed that you were getting weaker? Did you notice weight loss in yourself or even on the others? And was there anything that was particularly difficult?
Mairead was very, very late made up, you know, and I could see a big difference in her. I felt the cold. I am a cold, right? To this day, I'm like that. But that would have been sort of going into the second week. You just felt that wee bit, you know, just losing energy sort of thing. But nothing. I mean, I know people look at me when I say it. I mean, we were only on it 19 days, and you think the men were on it 50 odd days, you know.
I know, but for people who weren't on it,
I know,
3
yes,
days
I see where you're coming from, you know. And as I say, I took my period, which when I was just one of those unfortunate ones. I used to be a 6 as a dog, so that drained me for a couple of days on top of everything else, you know. But Mairead, I could notice the big difference in her weight. She was just gaunt, so she was. Although people said I was too, but I couldn't see it.
You can't see it yourself.
See, that's it. We were in the other wing. We were in the other wing, and it was
Yeah.
especially after they'd been moved to the hospital wing.
I think it was when you seen us at Mass.
They had to, no, it wasn't even at Mass. They had to come through.
Oh, walk through, yeah.
Our
Had to
wing
go through our wing to go
to
into the yard.
and they would have come over to our spy. Right, we weren't seeing much. It was a wee small spy hole that they would have been able for a few minutes, just would have been able to. And I remember that second week being shocked at their physical appearance, especially Mairead and Mary. Their whole jawline was, they were all teeth. They were just all teeth, and their whole jawline. So they mightn't have noticed it themselves.
Gradual for
but
them.
we hadn't seen them.
Yeah.
We hadn't seen them for, and okay, it was one, and it was probably the second week. But I remember thinking then, the women aren't going to last as long as the men, because I don't know. Obviously, we don't know anything about the body makeup and what we're saying. There's very little written about women on hunger strike. We know about men and how long they can kind of go. And I don't know whether it's because of their physical makeup or anything, but I just saw a big difference, and it was big, and it was in such a short space of time. And I remember being shocked at their appearance.
You know, obviously, like, there must have been times where it was extremely difficult. Like I can't even imagine. But see, like staying on the hunger strike, or did you find that was, you know, okay? And then as well, there must have been, like, did you just keep morale up with each other? Did you keep
had to. We kept ourselves busy.
Okay.
As I said, we were doing all the writing letters to everywhere, all over the world, anywhere, and they were getting smuggled out. And then we were keeping up, obviously, with what was happening in the blocks, and as I say, with Sean McKenna, and we were very concerned about that. So you didn't even have time to think about yourself, if the truth were told, you know. But we were there for one another. Comradeship was always 110%. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And obviously then you were worried about your families too, because you knew it was a vicious circle. They were worrying about you and you were worried about them. But then we were getting reports that, you know, of the different protests and rallies that was happening, you know, all over the areas and in Belfast and beyond. And that fairly, you know, I'd give you a good morale booster too, so it did.
And did you have visits while you were on?
Yes, and then we had Cardinal O'Fee. He came in. It was great. He had 200 carton figs up his plastic. So he was made very welcome.
And did he come into
the hospital wing? Yeah, he was allowed
And then he came round all the sales.
And he didn't have the 200 then.
So he gave us all cigarettes. He gave us all cigarettes out.
So, Sinead, you were obviously in a cell with my Auntie Mairead. You know that whole period when she would have said, right, I've been accepted onto hunger strike or whatever. How is that? Because obviously you would have been close in sharing a cell and all that.
But the thing about they moved them out right away, right on the first day. As soon as she declared, which as Mary says, there was already a statement was put out.
And on that, just one question I had. You were able to tell your families before the statement?
Oh yes,
was out?
yes, a couple of weeks before that. And obviously they kept it quiet. And that was hard.
Yeah.
You know, breaking it to, but my daddy, Lord have mercy on him, and obviously because I was his blue eye, he just said to me, I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was expecting to hear that, you know, and but it near killed me too, you know, but I was worried about him because I say he wasn't in great health, but he was 110%, as was all my family, right beside me.
What was the day to day then like at that point?
Most of the time, as Mary was doing there, we were doing the same thing in our wing. Most of the time we spent a lot of our time writing.
We spent all our time writing letters.
To anybody that we thought would listen to us.
And was there anyone in particular you felt listened?
Well, yeah, we did. Well, we were writing to America and we were writing to Europe and we were writing to
all over the world.
GAA clubs. And then our visitors would have come back and told us that they might have read out one of the columns at a GAA meeting or at a match or something like that from the women and from the men. So people were listening to us, and our visitors were coming back and telling us that people were supporting us and there was loads of support out there. So that was mainly, and during the day the screws were on our wings constantly, so we didn't really do that much during the day. The letter writing campaign would have been the main thing, and then it was at night time basically. Once the screws more or less went off the wing, they left the skeleton staff, and then that's basically when we would have, one of the, whoever you were in the cell with, one would have went to the door and would have went to the window and communicated with the ones on the other side and the ones along the same side, and that's when we would have found out things at night. We would have sang, we would have had an update on the 3 women. If Sheila had any update at all, she'd have shouted it out and told us what was happening, but we still tried to keep morale up by playing games, singing, anything at all. The mood did go down a bit, but
yeah, quizzes were great. Christine Beattie was the quiz master, and Christine was, I mean, she'd have lifted your mood without even realising what you had done, because she'd ask people for questions.
Oh, so everyone submitted them?
Yeah, and you wrote the questions, you wrote them on the wee bits of paper, and you sent them over to her during the day, and then she read them out at night. And there was times she couldn't read somebody's handwriting. And I remember one example when she shouted out, "Who wrote the play Shadow of a Bin Man?" And it was Shadow of a Gunman by Sean O'Casey. And some of the things that she came out with was just hilarious. She didn't do it intentionally, she just couldn't read the handwriting.
It was very funny always.
But no, she was great. And then there was bingo. You kept your 1 wee sheet, and this was written on prison issue toilet paper. So imagine what the prison issue toilet paper was like. So you wrote out your bingo thing, and should have called out the numbers, and this was for a rolled up in a piece of the Bible. That's what we used the Bible for.
The bingo was very popular. Everybody wanted the roll up.
Everybody cheated at bingo. So with stuff like that, people now would look back and say, "These people weren't wise," but then.
Kept us going.
Got you through the.
And we used to be able to communicate and put things out the window and pass from cell to cell.
With people with longer arms, is it?
No,
it was swinging.
Oh,
right. Had the swing.
You weighted it with the inside of a metal lighter and tied it to shoelaces.
Oh,
and then you threw it to the next cell, and they put their hand out and caught it, and that's how we moved.
And they caught it, but you kept holding it.
Yeah,
that's how we moved stuff along.
Otherwise, things would get lost.
Yeah. Some things were lost.
Some things were lost.
And see then,
my shirt was lost. I had like this. Used to wear a t-shirt and like the check shirt over it the whole time, the no wash, and I loved it. It was like a pink and grey check shirt with buttons, and I loved it. And one day we were out in the rain. We used to go out for an hour a day, and they're totally soaked. So I just came in and thought I'll put one thing at a time. There was a wee hole out through the wood to get out the window, and I threw it out to dry and thought it just trailed in. I trailed it back in, forgetting the barbed wire was right over the whole windows. My shirt, when I cried, my shirt was bits and pieces. Oh God.
when did you know, I suppose, that Bobby Sands was going to be going on hunger strike on that March 1st, and what was that?
Well, there had been contact again, there had been the discussions again in the prisons, and it's not that there were women who had come forward for a second hunger strike, because again it was discussed within the prisons, because we didn't keep anything from it was a company.
But when there was the talk, I did say I wanted to go back on the second hunger strike, and then the more I thought about it, I thought to myself, could I put my family through that again? And was I physically and mentally ready for it? I mean, that is something I've had to live with since it. And it was a very, very hard decision.
Of course.
You know, and as Sheila, I'm sure, will explain, there were so very few of us.
Of course, yeah.
That, and it's not that we didn't think that the first one wasn't serious, but we knew people were going to die the second one, and then for to be replacements, we just didn't have the numbers.
Because Mairead was the same. Mairead was in the same position. She'd already put, and I was in the cell with her, and I know, especially once that decision was made that she was withdrawing her name, then it nearly killed her. Absolutely broke her heart.
Seriously,
it was awful. It was awful trying to console her. It was worse. It was like a worse decision that she wasn't going on it than the time she was going on it.
Within Armagh Jail, some of you would have known some of the men better. There would have been connections, obviously, and all that kind of thing. How was that working? How did that work? That kind of work?
Everybody knew all the men better, but I mean, Mary would have been more friendly with Bobby Sands.
I wrote to Bobby.
And Sheila would have been in contact with them.
We went to the same school.
Primary or?
The secondary, Stella Morris, yeah. Because from my neck of the woods in North Belfast, he was Rathcoole then, before he moved to Twinbrook, and I was Greencastle.
Yeah, so then obviously for those women who would have known, so you've obviously known Bobby Sands personally, and there's that personal aspect as well, which is
a lot of the women knew some of the hunger
Mairead knew
strikers.
Joe McDonald very well. Kieran Doherty was a close personal friend of Mairead's. Eileen Morgan was a friend of Paddy. Paddy Quinn didn't die on the hunger strike. She was a close friend of Paddy Quinn's. She knew Raymond Krish as well.
Sean McCann.
She knew Sean McCann very well.
Dolores was engaged.
Dolores O'Neill was engaged to Tom McElwee. So every hunger striker, it wasn't that, it was just somebody you didn't know.
It wasn't just a name, it was a person.
I remember him, and I went to dances when he went to the dances, and he's great crack, and he's this. There's all this personal stuff that you knew about them.
But anybody who didn't know a hunger striker, they felt like they knew them.
Of course.
Yeah, and that's obviously the story.
Because you were hearing about them just non-stop, even before the hunger strike and during protests. We all sort of told each other, got a letter from this one, and this is, and this.
They all treated us like we sisters.
I was just going to say, you ended up becoming like a family. They were our brothers. And you heard all the stories about them.
There's things they couldn't tell their families in case it would annoy them, but they could tell us.
That makes sense.
So things that they wouldn't. So Paul Brennan used to be writing me letters from the H blocks, and it was always really about who was getting beaten up, who was getting scrubbed with a scrubbing brush, and I was telling him about the rat and how bad it had been. Whereas when my family came up on the visit, I was like, no, it was fine. No, I'm fine. No, I wasn't touched. I'm okay. Because I just thought I just can't stand my mummy crying, so I'm not telling her anything. So although they did find it out anyway, So they were actually telling us more than what they would have told family or friends.
And then see on the 5th of May then, when word came through, how did that word come through that Bobby had died?
Well, I know personally, they unlocked the door at 7:30, and I was walking up the wing. I met Brenda Murphy, and she says, did you hear? I was to go back, the screws were sort of standing all to the side, and there was like an old atmosphere on the wing. It was very, very quiet, and then Brenda Murphy said, Mary, did you hear Bobby died? I was in bits. I run back down into my cell and closed the door and fucking bawled my eyes out. I think everybody did, because it was mixed emotions. You felt frustrated because if you were outside, you might be, what you could have done, I don't know, but that was it. You felt anger, obviously, towards the Brits, Maggie Thatcher, and helpless, just felt helpless. And obviously your heart was breaking for his family. and obviously for the rest of them that had joined Bobby, you know, it was one of the lowest times for me personally in the jail. And you see, as each hunger striker day, it was the same feeling. It never diminished. You would have thought, that sounds terrible, you get used to it. Never, never. You were heartbroken, but going through every emotion that you could think of. But anger was definitely one of them, but the feeling so helpless, you know, and it was just a horrible period of our lives, you know, that year, 1981.
Yeah. And how was morale then within the jail, say, post that? You know what?
You see, I don't know. You see, when your back's to the wall, I think that's when we were always at our strongest.
Yeah.
And whether it's just because we're stubborn so-and-sos or whatever, but we would never ever let the Screws, Brits or anybody else
think any.
You know.
Yeah, no matter how you felt yourself, you always put up a front, and you were always conscious that they were there, they were on the wings.
Yeah.
They could have looked in at you at any time, so no matter how you felt, you put that face on. And that you had to get on with it, and I think it was like everything that happened in that year.
Yeah.
It was all bittersweet.
I think that helps a lot when you have to act like everything's normal and everything's okay, and you aren't annoying me, you know, and that helps. That absolutely helps push people through situations, and I think that worked very well for us, you know.
So I suppose 40 years on then, and I think that we would all be of the view that we are really getting close to a united Ireland, and that. How do you see, you know, the year struggle and that, and you know what's coming now, and how do you see the future, what the future holds, I suppose?
Personally, it was a very, very hard time, but what we did was necessary, because this was a stinking sectarian wee statelet, and that's all it's ever been. The changes that are coming along now, the equality changes, the demographic changes, but even the changes in terms of republicanism, our people are much more confident, our people are much more educated, and a lot of us didn't have the opportunities to get the educations. I would have loved to have went to college or went to university or loved to have had a career, but the circumstances that I grew up in, the circumstances that were forced upon me, didn't allow for that. I never would want a young person who has a future in front of them to ever set their foot through the doors of a prison, because none of us ever would if it wasn't for the circumstances that we grew up in. And I have to say it. The thing that sticks with me, and Bobby Sands was a prolific writer, and one of his most famous quotes is, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children," and we're reaping that now. We're seeing that now. I mean, yourself as an example of that. You look around young people, our elected representatives and our young people, their heads are up, and you know, and they're out there for it. They're out there to move forward, and I think that's the legacy of from 76 through to 81. That's the legacy, and we're reaping the benefits of it now. It's taken a while, but it's coming. It's there.
Well, that's it. I think Sheila just summed it up. That's just exactly what it is. And I don't think we would have been here where we are with the confidence of our young people or anything else, only for the hunger strikers.
And people have learned an awful lot about conflict resolution and transformation now, and transition from conflict. And anybody that has done that too, they'll find out any country who had a victory, an all-out overnight victory, it doesn't last long. So the idea of constant negotiating and trying to find a way forward is really what, you know.
It's that
really what we need.
You need to bring people with you, and you don't just need to bring your own people with you. You need to be able to reach out to, because for example, in my wee area, we grew up with nothing, but just across the road there were people who grew up with nothing too.
The legacy of Armagh, apart from where we're going, is the comradeship.
Yeah,
that was there. The comradeship that is still here today and will always be there.
Yeah.
And it's like what Mary, it's when your back's up against the wall, that's when you become the strongest. And there were so few of us. We became so close, and that was our family for so long.
Probably closer than sisters, and you know what? It's throughout your whole life there's a special feeling, and it's not that you need one of them. It's that they're there if you do.
You know, exactly.
And you know they'll run for you if you know, and it's fine and dandy that you don't need somebody, but it's that special feeling that you know they're there.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, Gurmila Maggie, I think that was a really, really good and beneficial conversation for us all to hear. And I think I just want to say thank you so much for taking part in this and for being so honest and being so open, and also for the bit of crack. So Gurmila Maggie.
Thank you.
Culture.
The hunger strike has ended in horrible circumstances. The deaths of men, the deaths of people outside of the prison. But within a period of 2 years, many of the demands that the prisoners had fought for, they won. Maggie Thatcher had boasted that the hunger strike was the last card of the prisoners. But H7 is now under the control, effectively, of the IRA. I often wonder this, but just for the purpose of this conversation, were the prison authorities so naive that they thought they had broken IRA prisoners? Did they really believe that?
We were working on that escape about 5 months before it happened, and it was a very, very small number of people. There were actually, when we started working on it in H7, there were more people in one of the other blocks who were camp staff were attached. That's the people gathering the intelligence, people like Larry Marley, Shawnee Bateson, who have since passed away, and people in the staff. There were more of them knew about it than within our block, and we kept it very, very tight. But I remember Bobby saying to me that we need to break down the security mentality that exists in this, and this is what we're going to do. So he's shoving me out, get out, and I don't care what you have to do, talk to them, so we ended up making them cups of tea. Me and Tony McAllister making them cups of tea, making them toast out in the circle. I was getting the back ripped clean out of me. By our guys. Somebody came up from the workshops one day and says, "You watch your back." Guy from H1, I was working in the metalwork, says, "He's lost a plot." He said, now here's the crack. See the security office there, or the control room. There was a wooden door which was closed, and there was a grill which was bolted and closed. Now, after about 3 weeks of me and Tony Tank and the other boys being out working in the circle area, we ended up that the wooden door was open, that the bar was off, and the lock wasn't on. And I was able to open that and walk in if he was on the phone and put down a cup of tea and a plate of toast. And the reason we made them toast was you couldn't put the plate through the grill bars.
Yeah,
so we had to open it, and he got, every time we made tea and toast for me and Tony, we made it for him. And they got so used to doing it that they ended up coming out. We would have cleaned the place out for them, and you're sitting looking at the alarm buttons, the intercoms, all the security apparatus. So we get in and out of there, and the only time they bolted it and put the padlock on was they got wired off in advance. Number 1 governor's on his way around, security governor's on his way around, oh, close the doors. And we would say to them, all right, and we'll take off down the wing of the road. And it was one of those relationships. And Bobby was always saying, just keep this going, keep it nice and tight, nice and easy. Nobody compromises anything. And we worked and worked and worked for months to get that. Instead of number McFarlane, it was back at your visit,
You've mentioned Bobby's story a number of times, the late Bobby's story, and it's clear from both of your contributions that he was key to the escape.
Oh, absolutely.
With others, but he was key to the escape.
Any prison anywhere in the world only functions with the agreement, really, of the prisoners to go along with it. And it's usually card and stick and all the rest of it, and maybe early release, or you're going to lose this, or whatever else. And I don't actually think we realised at the end of the hunger strike, and we got out, like the power we had. You have this group of, probably then it's about 500, if you put them all together, people, certainly 300-400 blanket men who are totally committed to achieving the outstanding demands, have this bond of solidarity, are creative, and there's nothing, bar nothing, that they're going to do to get it. And in light of that, they're like, no prison regime is ever going to stand up to it. And I remember, like, a security governor in Manchester too, like in later years, and everything was very relaxed then, and him first name terms against him. Orange, like, nobody ever knew what they would do once you come out from behind the doors. He was referring back to 81, and I could have said, well, if we didn't know what we were going to do, we'll come out.
We weren't sure either.
Yeah. So it was new, but there was that, once you had that bond and that discipline and that desire to get things, then it was going to be unstoppable.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Congressman Richard Neal, co-chairman of the Friends of Ireland Caucus in the United States Congress. This year marks the 40th anniversary of one of the most seminal moments in modern Irish history, when 10 Irish Republican prisoners died in the H blocks of Long Kesh, protesting the British government's refusal to recognize them as political prisoners. From March 1st to October 3rd, 1981, these young men captured the hearts and minds of people across the globe with their courageous protest against the policies of then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. I was a young city councilor in Springfield, Massachusetts at the time, and the bravery of these hunger strikers helped spark my interest to help bring peace, justice, and reconciliation to the island of Ireland. I have often said that you cannot overstate the significance of how the hunger strikers' deaths united Irish American opinion on the politics of the North. It was certainly a game changer. We read the news accounts daily, watched the televised funerals and the images of coffins bearing the tricolor not being allowed into the churches. It only further solidified Americans' opinion about the British government's treatment of these prisoners. I believe the death of Bobby Sands and his fellow Republicans was a decisive moment in a struggle that inevitably led to the IRA ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement. As we recognize the 40th anniversary of the hunger strikes, let us remember the strength and dignity of these brave young men and rededicate ourselves to building an agreed Ireland that promises a peaceful and more prosperous future for generations to come.
Today we stand in solidarity with the people of Ireland as we remember the 10 martyrs of the hunger strike at the Long Kesh prison from the 1st of March to the 3rd of October 1981. These martyrs were Bobby Sands, Francis Hughes, Patsy O'Hara, Raymond McCrish, Joe McDonnell, Martin Hassan, Kevin Lynch, Kieran Doherty, Thomas McElwee, and Michael Devine. Out of these struggles were born eternal bonds of solidarity, which have found further expression in this 40th commemorative event. It is a result of this that we stand together today as brothers and sisters in memory of the martyrs of 1981 and all of those people for whose freedom they selflessly sacrificed.
In the memorial of Bobby Sands and the heroes of Irish hunger strikers on their 40th anniversary, from Palestine, from the Freedom Theatre, from the children of Palestine, we say, freedom, freedom, freedom. Thank you.
Queridos hermanos irlandeses, patriotas irlandeses, antiimperialistas irlandeses, para expresar mi abrazo solidario por conmemorarse el 40 aniversario de esa gesta de resistencia heroica que patriotas irlandeses demostraron con poesía, con canto, con huelga de hambre, cuando se inmolaron en las cárceles británicas añorando un mejor porvenir para el pueblo irlandés. Cuando nombro la poesía, nombro al hombre, a dos viejos zapatos y a Carlota, y un vuelo triunfal de mariposas sobre un pueblo que canta en sol mayor.
Mi venganza personal será el derecho de tus hijos a la escuela y a las flores. Mi venganza personal será entregarte este canto florecido sin temores. Mi venganza personal será mostrarte la bondad que hay en los ojos de mi pueblo. Implacable en el combate siempre ha sido, y el más firme y generoso en la victoria.
Qui Roma, dalla banda Bassotti, dalla borgata Monte Spaccato, mandiamo un messaggio alle famiglie e a tutti i combattenti dell'Irlanda del Nord per la resistenza contro l'oppressione inglese, nel ricordo di Bobby Sands e di tutti i suoi fratelli caduti nella lotta, nello sciopero della fame. The strike.
As I walked through the Glen Shane Pass, I heard the younger nun. The boy from Fambladorf, she cried, is 3 years dead and gone. How my heart is torn apart for this brave man to lose, and I'll never see the lights again. Oh, my brave Francis Hughes.
Eraman zuten Francis Hughes gaztea baitaren lehen guxuton McElwee ere. Etorri ziren bazioara, Bobby Santa lagunen bila, Bostonen, Chicagoen, Saigonen, Santiagoen, Varsovian, Gasteizen eta Belfasten, eta beste hainbat lekutan, hau zerrenda maigabean. Ez dute uzten maitatzen gauean, ez agurrik ez negarri gauean. Ez zergatik ez norari gabe, sirena garra, bakarra gauean.
Call it the law, we call it apartheid, internet, conscription, partition and silence. It's the law that they make to keep you and me where they think we belong. The heavy hand steel and bulletproof glass, machine guns and spies. And tell us who suffer the tear gas and the torture they were in the wrong. And no time for love if they come in the morning. No time to sow tears or for fears in the morning. No time for goodbye, no time to ask why. And the sound of the sirens, the cry of the morning.
De mattina m'han trucat sopra il replà della scala, la mare quando sono vivo porta la mata mossata che voleva questa gente che le truppe le mantenevano.
Sophie che non so chi, nessa dormita la camera che ligo nell'angufì e fin mi cesta svegliava
la llei una hora assenyala ara l'estudiant és mort del trucat en del ball.
E urrune uniscia chi figliolo era onore, ma quando l'hanno trovato si è strappato il mio cuore. Ma franche raggio mare, le spaglie un mio d'errore, surela l'Irlanda, surela l'Irlanda.
Un giorno ti scriveremo quando la pace tornerà, quando la mente sarà asciutta per poi ci abbracciare. E su mondo di ingiustizia giuro che lo cascherà, surela l'Irlanda, surela l'Irlanda.
Oh yali yo we I first learned about the Irish Republican Army hunger strikers from the American press. Later, when I lived in the north of Ireland, I got to see firsthand the effects of British colonialism and the nationalist community's struggle for independence, sovereignty, and a united Ireland. I took those lessons home with me, and And today I can relate to my time in the north of Ireland and look at the Americans here as being simple colonizers who continue to repress First Nations, and that our struggle in many ways is the same struggle that the valiant hunger strikers face in the north of Ireland. We feel solidarity with them, and their struggle, their ultimate supreme sacrifice, I feel, will reverberate through the ages. That centuries from now, people will be inspired by their heroism.
So let me move you forward to 1991, and in a high security prison, with all the apparatus around you and all this security around you, prisoners were able to produce a cassette in a prison cell with cameras outside it and prison warders on the periphery of it. Who had this idea? Who can we blame on this?
Well, if I can just say that not guilty for the inception of the idea, well, so I'm going to have to hand it over to him, because it was actually him and Brian Campbell, I think, along with
the late Brian
Campbell, and I'll let him take this through. But they come up with this idea because every year in prison, you know, come up to commemoration periods, you put blackberries on, you smuggle them, and you walk around the yard, and you end up locked up for 2 weeks, and there's raids, and they come up with this idea of doing a pageant.
How cheeky is
right,
that?
I'm going to let him,
How
because
cheeky.
it was his sort of, you know, poetic thinking and artistic thinking that come up with.
Well, the general idea, I mean, a lot of things changed over the years. I was doing the Open University, as were a number of other prisoners, and there's cassette tapes as part of it that would be sent as part of our course, but to actually listen to them, what the prison education department did, they brought around this trolley on wheels with these big, huge recorders, and you had to go to the classroom and you listened to it there, and then that was it. So you didn't get this.
It wasn't under your control.
Wasn't under control. The teacher brought it around. Actually, Kate Campbell was the woman we followed. Who was a teacher, who later left her role in the job, very well-paid role, and went outside and worked voluntarily for Sinn Féin, and unfortunately died tragically at a young age of cancer. Yeah. Anyway, Gino McCormick, who was a former blanket man, said to me one day when I met at the education, he says, "You know, only one of them machines can actually record." It's just, again, by accident, trial and error, found it. So again, I got Kit to bring the thing up, and didn't know what was going to do, something was going on, but it was just to bring this thing up. So really what we did on the day was organise, Mickey was like always clean out his cell, we'd run the wire around, they would be pulled over. We got a lot of mattresses out of the other cells, put them in, and the only people who knew it was happening was Mickey and the wing OC. So we told them, so if anybody asked, the lads are practicing a wee bit for another bit of a session, we're going to have a bit of a party in a week's time. But yeah, we turned the cell into the studio with these blankets, because otherwise the cell would be really echoey. Yeah. And we had about 2 hours to do it, and it had to be finished because I had to get the thing back till
the tutor
before
and the cell effectively became a recording studio.
I was nervous about this whole thing because we had selected so many songs, practiced them and timed them, and a cassette is 90 minutes, and we had to do everything.
This cassette?
Yeah, that cassette, 90 minutes. So once you finish, Lawrence would hit pause, and then you're ready for the next song, and then hit play, and you sing the next one. And that's the way it had to be. And we had rehearsed the whole thing, and yeah, that's within the 90 minutes. And then we had a yarning session at the end of it. And at the end of that cassette, when he played it back, there were 10 seconds of space left on the cassette after we had finished, because we ad-libbed after the music had gone and the poetry had done and the introductions. We just ad-libbed, and he decided, look, I just want to ask everybody, how do you feel about this? What's the experience of doing this? And everybody was elated, you know, really excited about the whole project. And when he pressed that at the end, and then he ran it back and went through it, was 10 seconds left of free time on the 10 seconds, and we got it all.
I'm 90 miles from Dublin town. I'm in an H-block cell. To help you understand me
Clyde, this story now I'll tell. I'm on the blanket protest, my efforts must not fail, for I'm joined by men and women in the Kesh and Armagh jail. As I walk through the Glen path, I heard a younger one, the boy from town, the dog, she cried, is 2 years dead long. Time to remember, I never can forget them playing Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Russian land. Michael Hatton, your blood, where have you gone? Cry a million choking men. Where are you, Saxon Borneo? Will your legs be seen again? Here's a jig to the man and a reel to the drop. Swing to the girl loves. May your fiddle play in pots and cheer company up above. The time is come to part, my love. I must go away. I lead in a darling girl. No longer can I stand. Let the music keep the spirits high. Let the thoughts keep the children right. Let creation reveal the secret. By and by, by and by, by and by, by and by. When the light is lost in heaven, reaches the sky. Refuse my creation sons, Doherty and Lynch, MacDonald horses, McElwee divine.
I got the tape smuggled out and sent it to Chrissy Moore and Donal Lunny to listen to it and asked, should we put on music accompaniment, and they come back, which was the correct answer, said, no, this is an authentic piece.
Absolutely.
Just leave this totally as it is.
Well, it's high approval when Christy Moore tells you it's okay.
And there's another great wee funny story about it was we got it produced and the POW department did a great job. And someone wrote to, it might have been Sammy Wilson, who was the council at the time, and under a bum named of Lewis.
Maisie Disgruntled from Sandy Road.
Disgruntled, they were down in Smithfield Market and found this tape outrageous. These Republican prisoners are allowed to record this here and blah, blah, blah. And the councillor, if it was Sammy or somebody else, got up and did in the council and one of the others said something. And the NIO,
talkback.
Yeah, the NIO turned around and said, it was obviously recorded when the prisoners were on parole. We says, but Bick's not on parole. We're recording songs that Bobby Sands, including ones that Bobby Sands wrote, in a cell with a smuggled pen on smuggled cigarette papers hidden inside his body. It's the continuity of struggle in a new way, and we're using the arts in a way which I think is a great way to do it. And we're showing not just our ingenuity that we're able to record this, but with great musicians doing it, and it is a spirit of freedom that Bobby wrote about, and I still want to listen to it now and again. It certainly stands the test of time, and as if you're looking at research as a sort of primary source or an archival piece, it's the voices of people from that time in the jail, not being outside and recording something or later years talking about it. This is actually when you're listening to it. This is taking place in the jail in Long Kesh.
Looking forward in all this, where do we go? How do you think the shape of life is for this island that we live on?
I think that it's always worthwhile to look back at where we've come from, to see just how far we've come. Now Long Kesh is closed. It was preserved by Republican ex-prisoners who coached it, so it will be there as a living memory, and it may be closed at the minute, but I have absolutely no doubt that it will be there as a living museum and a memory of what was done to our own people. I see a whole new generation coming up, even my own daughters and other ex-prisoners, daughters and sons, and they're leading a full life, they're educated, they're confident, they're wearing their GAA tops, they're speaking the Irish language. I mean, it just grows and grows and grows. And there's an eagerness on their part even to hear about that, and it is history to them now.
Yeah.
But they know where they came from and where their parents came from, and the role they played in the struggle and what they're doing. And their issues now are new issues, whether it was like same-sex marriage or a woman's right to choose or whatever, access to education, being part of the EU, or whatever. I think that just as within the jail, the struggle changed. I mean, I've often said 1981 ended that period of, I've called it a period of rebellion, and began a period of revolution. Like, we had probably an attitude before, and Ernie O'Malley talks about this during the time of the 1916 era, and Ireland produced a lot of rebels, but not so many revolutionaries. This idea that, yeah, throw it at us, we'll take it, we'll throw it back at you. And the blanket protest, the no-wash protest, hunger strike, was that sort of, and that's not
Defiance.
that's not being, yeah, it's defiant.
Yeah.
It's not been critical. After 81, we had exhausted all of it. There was nothing else we could do physically that was ever going to surpass that. So we had to really think, and an awful lot of soul searching, agonising soul searching about where do we go forward. And part of it was not even realising the strength of it, and the strength was in our numbers and in our unity and in our discipline. And once you bring that together at any stage, whether it's in jail or outside or whatever, then you're going to be successful. And that idea of never been boxed into a corner and always looking for the opportunity. And I think that's what's happened outside, and the struggle outside has changed as well. And as it changes, and that brings about other changes too. But I think our strength has been the strength of the Republican movement, is that we have been open to that, because the only thing you can be sure of is change happens. And those who try to which is, I think you get on the unionist side, try to hold, but you never can. It's King Canute.
The same question to you, Rick.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's covered, a massive amount of analysis in relation to that there. But if you're looking back into the jail from there, where you're going, you're moving forward. The day that Bobby Sands got elected, right, from Fermanagh South Tyrone, was a watershed, because that showed people that we can do this. Not only that, in the aftermath of that we can provide a clear political alternative to what exists as politics, which was a mishmash of pure crap in this country, right? That we can provide that there. You have integrity, you've got good leadership, and Lawrence has made the point about young people coming through who don't have our baggage. They're educated, they're confident, they're in your face. No matter where you go, they will stand up there and they will articulate their politics, their history, their culture, every single aspect about it. And I was thinking when he was talking there, some of the aspects, the day that we went up to Stormont and put that whole thing on with the kids hurling up in front of the green in Stormont with the flags up, we had a whole day of activity, and unionists who were out jogging, running through, were mesmerised by the fact that we had taken over the grounds of Stormont. People, the puck fada, and no, we're not ramming this down your face. This is part of our culture. This is where we are. We're moving forward. Come along with us. Move along. Let's move it forward. I have great hope, and I think that coming out of that hunger strike period, I believe the watershed in that period was almost like a foundation stone for the development and the enhancement of Republican politics that has brought us along a road here. We just need to keep true to the vision and keep true to the politics of revolutionary struggle. And I think that, while I am one that's not satisfied that we're not moving fast enough, I want things to happen yesterday, not tomorrow.
But we're coming near the end of the programme, and I'd love you to do another song from the cassette, if you don't mind.
Joe, so yeah, I'd love to do this one from Music from the Blacks. This is actually a song that I wrote on the 10th anniversary of Bobby's death and hunger strike. It's a song that I titled Song for Marcella, so I always do it in memory of Bobby and all the hunger strikers. Doesn't seem quite so long ago last time that I saw you. Ain't it funny how the memories grow? Seems they always fold around you, trying to break you in a living hell. But they couldn't find a way, so they killed you in an H-block cell. I hope that all would turn away. I thought your spirit wouldn't rise again, but you dared to prove them wrong. And in death you tore away the chains to let the world hear freedom's song. Yet the heartache and pain linger on. They're still here, though it's so long since you've gone. But we're stronger now. You showed us how freedom's fight can be won. I wish there was an easy road to choose to bring the heartache to an end. But easy roads are always sure to lose. I've seen it time and time again. If you could stand by me like yesterday, I'd find the strength to carry on. So let your spirit shine along the way, and our day will surely come. Yet the heartache and pain linger on. They're still here, though it's so long since you've gone. But we're stronger now. You showed us how freedom's fight can be won if we all stand as one.
A very fitting end to a very fitting programme. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Very good.
Come, Irishman, I pretend, and listen to these words I tell, for I sing ole from a bygone day, for the brave young lads we all knew well. Young lads who died that freedom's light might shine so bright across the land. For no braver men has Ireland seen than O'Hara, Hughes, Creeshan Sands. Young Irishman in Ulster born, deprived of freedom, work and hope, oppressed by ruthless racist laws that grind men down beneath the yoke. And when the bloodhound comes at night to terror strike across the land, with their tanks and guns and poor man's sons, O'Hara roots and bars leave lifelong scars. These brave men's spirits ne'er did yield. The words of Christ then came to mind, who would give up his life for his fellow man. And the volunteers without dread or fear were O'Hara, Hughes, Macreation, Sands. For 70 days these men they lay under Margaret Thatcher's tyranny, and British churchmen came to say that no clergyman their souls could free. But far and wide with tears and pride their story was told in distant lands. So your voices raise, we will sing in praise. O'Hara, Hughes, Macreation, Sands. Now brave men die, and slick men lie, and weak men turn their heads away. But short is the hour of those in power who truth and the rights of man betray. But the fight will go on and will not be done while man is unfree in this fair land. And in freedom's days we will sing in praise of Ohio.